morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on behalf of the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to extend a special recognition to Congressman Arnaldo Jardim, Congressman Jorge Vidal, and Congressman Leandro Bussi. Also recognition of Ambassador Enio Cordeiro, the Consul General here in New York, and also to Mr. Roberto Ndengui, the Deputy Consul who's helped put this event together. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, first to Debevoise in Plimpton for their gracious use of this space, as well as help in arranging the seminar, and also for David Anciento and Pantalica, who were instrumental in making this event happen. I'm actually, the Chamber's mission is to promote trade and investment flows between Brazil and the United States and forge closer ties and greater understanding between the two business communities of both nations. This is an excellent example of the type of programming that we do. I'm actually particularly excited about this event. I was for 9 years with Panelists, Petróleos de Venezuela, and 17 with Petrobras. So I'm an oil and gas guy, and ethanol was always this very poor cousin, okay? But, little guys, okay? But in this age of decarbonization, and ethanol, I think, has a very bright future. And what I've learned as we put this together is that the Chamber, we focused on certain events such as labor reform, the capital markets reform, but kind of flying under the radar is this new Renova Bio, which has, I think, great prospects for the future. And what's more, also a great example of how markets, business people, and Congress can work together to create good policy and good rules. It's an excellent example of that. I think we'll hear more about that. Finally, last point, 18 years working now with Brazilians, I've learned that Brazilians take their birthdays very seriously. They leave work early, they party with their friends and family, etc. And as I was doing the research on Congressman Arnaldo Jardim, I realized today's his birthday. So, anyway. I'd now like to turn it forward to our moderator, Jasmine from Debevoise.
Good morning. My name is Jasmine Ball, partner here at Debevoise in our Latin America practice, as well as our restructuring group, where I work on both company side and investor side matters with respect to stressed, so pre-distressed, as well as distressed investments in and across industries. And most of them have a significant cross-border component, in particular Latin America. I'm actually very excited about this morning's panel on sugar and ethanol in Brazil. And those in the far end, let me know if you can't hear, and I will move closer to the mic, because sometimes we have to sit closer to the mic. We have an absolutely amazing group of speakers for you today, and it's been a true pleasure to work with Ted and Ruth and everybody else from the Brazilian Chamber of Commerce on this event. So I have the honor of introducing our speakers today. I'll be relatively brief as I want to get to the presentations. They all have amazing bios, which you can Google or look on their company sites for. To my right is our surprise guest this morning, Dr. Plinio Nastari. He's the president of DataGrow and the civil society representative at the National Council for Energy Policy. DataGrow is Brazil's leading consulting company on sugar and the ethanol market and the analysis of the market. Dr. Nastari regularly offers consulting services to producers, banks, trading companies, fuel distributors, and governments. He has very impressive master's and doctoral degrees in agricultural economics and has been a lead author and expert in the area of ethanol, sugar, environmental matters, and import and export issues for over 30 years. To his right is Congressman Arnaldo Jardim. Happy birthday. This is great. Who is currently in his very impressive third term in Congress. He's also served as Secretary of Agriculture and Supply in the state of Sao Paulo and Chairman of the National Council of the Agricultural Secretariats. He began his political career as a student leader at the Polytechnic School of USP, where he studied civil engineering, which is near and dear to my heart as I studied civil engineering as well. He's authored numerous state policies. He's coordinated parliamentary fronts for various initiatives and was also the head of Mines and Energy Commission and the president of the Parliamentary Front on Defense of National Infrastructure. Very, very impressive among very many other things that he's done. To his right is Joel Valesco. He's a principal at Albright. You're over here. You switched. Okay.
Don't worry.
Now I have to change my order. So, to his left, I'll continue going left, is Alexandre David, who is a founder and partner of David Aniceto and Associates, as well as the founder and president of the Brazilian Agribusiness Law Association. Alexandre has more than 15 years of experience advising in areas related to agribusiness, debt restructuring, banking, corporate finance, capital markets, and M&A. He's also a member of the Agribusiness Commission of the Brazilian Bar Association. To his right is Salvatore Milanese, who's the founder and senior partner at Panelists Partners. He's over 24 years of experience. You couldn't tell by looking at him, but he's had over 24 years of experience in the turnaround and restructuring processes, special situations, transactions, and investing in distress, including working on a lot of high-profile judicial and extrajudicial restructuring processes in numerous different sectors. Salvatore also has a lot of straight M&A and finance experience, so it's not all distressed, and he's very familiar with cross-border transactions. Now if I go back to the other side of the table, and so to my left now is Joel Valesco, and now I've moved the cursors to your side too. He's principal at Albright Stonebridge Group, and he's the former chief U.S. representative in North America for the Brazilian Sugarcane Industry Association, where he led its efforts to expand the biofuel and sugar markets. Prior to his roles at Albright Stonebridge, he served as senior advisor to the U.S. ambassador to Brazil and as a personal aide to Vice President Al Gore in the White House. And to his left is my fellow compatriot, Daniel, who's also at Debevoise. He's in our litigation group here. He focuses on white-collar international investigations and anti-corruption and compliance matters. He has a particular concentration in Latin America. He also works generally on international arbitration matters and regularly advises companies in connection with compliance and other related risks for mergers and acquisitions. So it's not all litigation and that. So now on to just a couple of administrative items and then the good stuff. Those of you who are in the room, feel free to go and get another coffee or some more breakfast. We have you for 2 hours, so don't hesitate to get up and go grab some coffee if you need to. Then a legal disclaimer. For those of us on the panel, the views are generally our personal views unless noted otherwise, and feel free to ask us questions during the discussions, but we will also have a Q&A at the end. Now, on to the good stuff. We're going to cover a lot of material this morning, and we'll try to keep moving through the agenda so we can cover as much as possible. Joel is going to actually start by providing an overview of the macroeconomic landscape, what's happened in the industry, and then that will be followed by Arnaldo and Pinho, who will cover the Brazilian governmental current policies going on, and then we will move on to some panel Q&A with Salvatore, Alexandre, and Daniel on some of the investment and legal aspects. So without further ado, I will hand the clicker over to Joel for his slides.
Great. Great to be here, and real pleasure to talk to you guys, especially being part of this panel. They're the real experts. I lived this industry for about 4 years. I would say four very good years. Despite Debevoise's efforts, we did pretty well in the sugarcane industry in Brazil. So I have a little bit of a perspective to be also in terms of disclaimer. I'm not actively involved in this space now. I'll let Linu and Arnaldo correct the record wherever it needs to be, but I just want to give you guys a little bit of a context. And I went back to some of my old slides and was just pulling sort of things that I used to use to explain a little bit of the issue in Brazil, and so it was a little bit of a traveling down the memory lane. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, Brazil is the world's largest sugarcane producer. Sugarcane has been in Brazil basically for as long as, for the last basically 500 years. The Portuguese brought it over. It began as a crop really in the northeastern part of Brazil, but it's 90% of the crop today is produced and harvested in the south central part of Brazil, where you can see there, especially not probably in for this audience, but in the U.S. there was always this, they're growing sugarcane in the Amazon. I always reminded people it really doesn't grow in the Amazon, for as a matter of fact, but it also won't do well. Cane needs a very clear period of drought, as well as a lot of sun and rain, and some of those things don't really exist in the Amazon. But with Brazil being number one in terms of sugarcane, a lot of attention has put on, how can you do better in this industry, and what else can you do? And I think what the Brazilian experiment shows is that cane is a great crop, not only for food production and obviously sugar, but also for energy production. And that obviously most people are familiar with ethanol, but there's a range of other products. I was actually involved in a biotech company that was really still is producing more complex molecules through sugar fermentation. Just to, again, still just reminding people a little bit of the context in Brazil. This is another kind of chart that was often used and still is used, but it's just to kind of give you context. Imagine that square box is Brazil landmass. What's important to understand is only about 23% of the entire country is actually in pasture land. About 7% is cropland, and I'm always reminding people that even though sugarcane is Brazil's so big in sugarcane, it really only uses about 1% of its arable land for cane production. And the point here is not only it has a lot of room to grow sustainably, but it hasn't actually, and this is I think one of the dilemmas because you cannot know, partly because of the demand issues. Just to get everybody kind of, and you'll hear a lot of numbers probably later on, but if you take Brazil as a whole, you're talking about 650 million tons of cane harvested. That's what's removed from the field. All of that's brought into cane mills, primarily in south central Brazil from April all the way kind of to the end of the year. That's kind of the harvest year. And they will produce about, out of that 650 million tons, 40 million tons roughly this year of raw sugar. Most of that is going to the export market. Brazil represents about 50%, I think, still of the global trade in sugar. So if you see a sugar ship out there, there's 1 in 2 chance that it's probably Brazilian sugar. It also produces a lot of ethanol in 2 forms, hydrous, which is really what just basic hydrous and anhydrous. Ethanol, as we have here in the U.S., before it's blended with the gasoline, is anhydrous. It doesn't really, all it is how much water there is in it, and most of the Brazilian cars today are flex fuel, so they can actually take a mix of those. But in total, Brazil produces almost 8 billion gallons, so put it in gallons because I think most of us here in the U.S. are familiar with that, of ethanol fuel right now, and the vast majority of that stays in the domestic market. And there's another product, there's actually a number of other products the industry produces, but one that's very important, especially in terms of the financial aspect of it is electricity. You'll hear terms about cogeneration and so forth. And that's basically after you squeeze the cane and you get the juice and you either make sugar or ethanol from it, you're left with basically a gas. If you've ever seen cane, you'll kind of appreciate this. And it's that is then burned, used to be kind of burned to get rid of because the quantities are immense. But then really to produce, you burn it in not only to produce steam and electricity for the mill itself, so the mill is self-sufficient in power, which has a very positive impact on the environmental side, but also then sell the surplus electricity. So I always use the jokes as the industries make sugar, ethanol, and then electrons, really, pushing electricity into the grid. And it's not an insignificant amount. I think it's still around 3% of Brazil's total electricity use is coming from these mills. But I think one of the things I'm always fascinated with is there are points during that, especially when sugar prices may depress, ethanol prices were, especially during the Juma government, electricity actually was one of their very successful products. It was actually, people were making good money on that side, mostly selling some either in the spot market or in contracts. It just allows you to be much more diversified. And this is one of the really, I think, interesting things of this industry is figure out a way to diversify itself pretty well. Sticking to my memory lane, I found a slide, I believe, I can't remember exact date when I gave this presentation, but this was a projection that UNICA, the trade association for the cane industry in Brazil, had made. I think this was around 2007 or so. And at that point, the industry was projecting, remember I gave you 650 as current production. That's today. They were projecting, obviously, to be somewhere around, just 900 million tons back in around this time, so quite a bit less. Sugar production is not too far off at 41, so 40 in the low 40s. But ethanol production just did not increase the way the expectations were, and that's really because the industry didn't grow. You saw no more mills being produced. So from the boom years, if you think about it, there was an expectation that the industry was going to be 2 times as big, or at least in terms of production. And the reality is, I think they'll point out that there's been more closures than, I don't know if there's been a new greenfield plant in Brazil for several years. So that's kind of the context that when you think about the industry, is it really expected to grow a lot over the last few years, but it hasn't. And I think then if you look at sort of, the history of this is just looking at cane crop production chart. If you go back to the 70s when Brazil started having government policies to incentivize the production of ethanol from the sugarcane mills. That was done really because oil prices, as we all know, in the 70s skyrocketed, and Brazil really didn't have enough ethanol or enough fuel, gasoline, and didn't have the foreign exchange to import it. So it started to say, okay, well, let's just substitute and start producing ethanol. So there's a huge incentive program, which is where a lot of these mills emerged. There was quite a bit of growth. I mean, you basically doubled or so the size of the industry. And then when we get into the 90s, as oil prices both drop, and the Brazilian government really shifts from a command control policy on sugar to a deregulated market, you really this is when the industry suffered quite a bit. I always reminded that one of the things that saved the industry, and by the way, at that point is when you see Brazil going from a very relatively small size raw sugar exporter to a real global powerhouse. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the key drivers of this was the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we end up having, if you look at Cuba's sugar production to Eastern Europe begins to drop, and Brazil just becomes a global player and begins to participate in this international market of sugar. So that was a big driver for a little bit, but it wasn't enough. And the big change happened in the early 2000s with the advent of basically an old new technology, which is flex fuel cars, and basically it's a change in the computer chip of the fuel injector and some changes in the parts that allow for the vehicle to accept different, both gasoline or gasoline ethanol or just ethanol. And with obviously some will say some performance sacrifices, but some huge environmental benefits as well as economic ones. And at one point, 9 out of 10 vehicles sold in Brazil were flex fuel. I'm not sure we're quite there anymore. Lino can provide some update. But that with the advent of high oil prices, you saw consumers, instead of having, back in the early 80s, you had to buy a car that only ran on ethanol or a car that ran gasoline. Instead of having to make that choice at the gas station, people began to make that choice at the pump. And it was a great opportunity for the industry to grow. Obviously came around the time of also significant investments and focus on climate change and so forth. So you see this big bump. And really since then, the sector has struggled. I think if you could blame one person, I would probably say the president of Brazil was probably, Dilma Rousseff was probably the most responsible for deterioration, but I think it really is a combination of factors, largely driven by oil prices, largely driven by the financial situation of some of these producers, and I would sometimes say maybe some exaggerated expectations of the future. So then when I want to think about, and this is my last slide, just as we think of the discussion we'll probably have here, is there are three things that I always like to point out on this in this industry. First, it's let me kind of call it my own personal lessons on this, is commodity cycles, it's capital intensity, and then the policies. And I think we're going to talk, let Lino and Arnaldo are going to talk a lot more about the policy aspects domestically. But first, the commodity cycle. I mean, just don't underestimate the volatility in this space. Historically on sugar, when I'm talking sugar, I'm talking raw sugar, number 11, but also on the fuel side. It is often said in Brazil that, and valid around the world, is, these commodity prices, they go up by, the prices rise through a stairwell, but they come down in an elevator. And that really can, you see, overnight have a huge impact. I mean, right now, the big issue, I would say, for this immediate year is the number 11 sugar prices. You see a larger than expected production in India. India is the second largest producer of sugar. And that has depressed Brazilian currency. As we're seeing, a lot of countries' currency fluctuations can have an impact on this. So if you need to be ready for lots of ups and downs. This is probably the one part that, oil and gas industry is like, yeah, we're used to that, right? They don't really think it's but people just assume, well, no, this is sort of a niche product. No, this is maybe a niche product, ethanol, but it still has significant volatility. The other part is, and I think this is unique to sugarcane, this is a very capital-intensive industry. I think there's always an expectation, well, they grow so much cane, it kind of grows everywhere, they just need land. No, you need a lot of not just from the field, whether it's harvesting equipment, to the actual, I would say, refineries. This is very capital intensive. A lot of steel, a lot of land, and a lot of people. The cane industry in Brazil, indirectly has about 1 million people working in it, and this is despite the fact that most of the cane is harvested with machinery. So it's a pretty big undertaking. And issues like logistics in Brazil, this is true for all infrastructure issues that you have in Brazil, but also this evolving regulatory structure of all of these things can increase cost for the production, and also, just give the example of having to mechanize the harvest requires buying very expensive harvesting machines. So now you've got to add, multi-million-dollar expenses just to harvest the cane that you didn't have before. The last one, and then I'll turn over to the other speakers, is really policy. This is still, as I've showed in that historical chart, this is still very much of an industry that is dependent on policy to drive demand, and policy both to drive demand both up and down. As I said, President Rousseff, I think, helped really drive demand down. The U.S. has had a very interesting policy on renewable fuels that created a lot of expectation of driving demand up. I think the big lesson out of that, and somebody wants to talk more about it, is that there was an expectation that this would be a boondoggle for Brazil because they would incentivize lower carbon fuels and the U.S. would need it and Brazil would produce it. Yes, but Brazil didn't produce it, so the demand, the mandate didn't really come through for it. But more importantly, the U.S. production of ethanol continued to grow. So if Brazil produces 7-8 billion gallons of ethanol a year, the U.S. now produces about 15 billion. So, and it went from much smaller than that, and that has led to a huge excess surplus of ethanol in the U.S. market that ultimately needs to find a home somewhere else. And so what you've been seeing over the last few years is a lot more ethanol, instead of leaving Brazil, coming to the U.S. because the renewable fuel standard, actually the renewable fuel standard encourages all this production in the U.S. and they, as it happens because of commodity cycles, overproduce. Cheap corn led to cheap ethanol, and that cheap ethanol has found a home in Brazil. The Brazilians, I think, I was very much against it, impose a tariff to try to reduce the flow of ethanol into the domestic market, but nevertheless, a lot of ethanol is making its way into Brazil from the U.S. And unfortunately, there isn't a global market for ethanol as there is on sugar. And so you end up having a kind of challenge there because with the U.S. having overproduced ethanol and will continue to do, and cost of capital and so forth, that people aren't really willing to pay that much of a premium for the lower carbon fuel. And then the other one, that's kind of an external policy driver. The other one is, and I'll just mention it by name, is this Brazil's Renova Bio, which is really a similar type policy. Is much modeled after the California low carbon fuel standard, which is much less focused on volume and more focused on reduction of carbon intensity of fuels. But on paper, and legislation has been approved and now regulation needs to come into effect, should drive a lot more demand for ethanol in Brazil. The big question is, will that be enough to spur a new resumption of growth in the sector, or will it just simply be another sort of, well, it helped for a little bit, but not for long? So I'll stop there. I would say happy to take any questions, and I hope it doesn't have too many things to correct.
First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Ball, for the introduction. Congressman Jardim, very nice to see you here. I have to confess to all of you, I have been a long-term voter to Congressman Jardim. He started his career in politics as a state legislator, and I have followed his career, and I'm very glad and honored to say that I have been consistently voting for him. So I'm very glad to be seated by his side here. He has been leading an impressive record of legislation in favor of biofuels and renewable energy. So it's very appropriate that he participates in this panel. Other members of the panel, hello. Ambassador Plinio Cordeiro, thank you very much for attending this meeting. It's an honor to have you here. Also, Minister Roberto Dengue. Ambassador Cordeiro is the Consul General of Brazil in New York. And Minister Dengue is the Consul General for Trade Relations. Thank you very much. Mr. Ted Helms, Executive Director of the Brazil Channel. Debevoise, our host, thank you for hosting the event, and all supporting organizations. Well, I'm going to be talking to you about specifically this novel regulation, which was developed in Brazil quite recently. I'm going to give you the chronology of its development. started as an idea, conceptual idea, launched in December 2016, and evolved quickly in a lot of dialogue, not alone within the government, but with all sectors of the economy involved in this issue and the civil society. And why it's relevant? Well, it's relevant because, you know, Brazil has a population of 206 million people. Considering its proportion of global population, you know what I mean. But Brazil is the third largest, is responsible for the third largest consumption of transport fuels, right after the US and China. So it's a very impressive number globally and also for Brazil. Sugarcane in particular is the second most important source of energy in primary energy supply in Brazil, responding for 17.5% of total energy supply in Brazil, second only to oil products, larger than hydropower. Hydro responds for 12%, sugarcane is 17.5%, much larger than natural gas and everything else that comes after it. And as mentioned by Joel, the sugarcane industry has had an impressive development since the diversification process towards ethanol started in 1975 more intensively. Let's remember that ethanol has been used in Brazil since 1927, but intensification started in 75 with the alcohol program. And because of this process of diversification, Brazil was able to increase the supply of total reducing sugars from 7.1 to 87 million tons of total reducing sugars in this these 43 years. And you can see in this graph what is sugar in yellow, what is anhydrous ethanol, which is in blue, ethanol blended in gasoline, and what is hydrous alcohol in green, which is the one used by the flex fleet, which, by the way, today accounts for 75 of Brazilian fleet of light vehicles. But you can see in this graph that since 2010, the supply of total reducing sugars has been stable because of the reasons that Joel mentioned, particularly the interference in prices of gasoline in the previous government, and the crisis that has been caused for that policy. One thing that has been brought by this diversification is the ability of producers to change production mix very quickly and adapt to relative prices of sugar and alcohol, which is an advantage that Brazil has acquired and is being used over time, in particular this year, to overcome the sugar glut, which is currently happening from excess supply in India, Thailand, European Union, and other places. But sometimes not enough to compensate for the surpluses which are being generated. And in spite of the fact that Brazil is this powerhouse recognized worldwide for sugar and alcohol, over the years we have never had a regulation which would at least set a record of where this industry should be leading to. What would be the long-term target to guide investments, which are very capital intensive, yes, and require long-term planning. Because of this growth, Brazil is today the largest cane producer in the world by far. The world produces some 1.5 billion tons of cane. Brazil is responsible for 641 million tons this past crop. And second comes India. And Brazil's second producer of ethanol after the US. Last year, 27.8 billion liters, the US 59.2 billion liters. Third comes the EU with 5.2 and so forth. But when you look at what Brazil has been able to achieve in terms of gasoline substitution, it by far is the country that has done most in that area. Last year, Brazil was able to substitute 39.4% of its gasoline equivalent by ethanol. The US is only 9.9. After Brazil, we have Paraguay with 24. We have Argentina with 15. We have Colombia with 8. We have Thailand with 12.4. But that tells, the importance of what has been done and achieved in Brazil, in spite of the lack of a regulation establishing the game rules for people to play in the free market space. And when we talk about the consequences of emissions in transport fuels and the relationship of those emissions with global warming in the world, we see that greenhouse gas emissions in the generation and use of energy, most of it comes from electricity and heat in the world. Transport fuels account for 23%. It's not irrelevant, it's very important. That's why people are addressing transport fuels as means of mitigating global warming. But in Brazil, it's 43%. Energy in transport accounts for 43% of greenhouse gas emissions in CO2 equivalent. In spite of the fact that Brazil has the cleanest fuels matrix in the world. Almost 27% of our fuels are renewable fuels in the form of anhydrous ethanol, hydrous ethanol, and biodiesel. So Brazil cannot avoid addressing the issue of transport fuels if it wants to comply with its commitments to the Paris Agreement. And that's why there was the opportunity of designing RenovaBio. And RenovaBio is this regulation where innovation and efficiency in biofuels production and use is at the center of the country's strategy for the use of low carbon sources of energy. And it's a regulation which is very interesting. It's not a subsidy, it's not a carbon tax, it's a certification program. And I'm going to explain briefly what it is about. If we were to summarize RenovaBio in 2 words, these 2 words would be induction and recognition. Induction for energy efficiency in production and use, and recognition of the ability of each biofuel to promote carbon reduction. What is the target? The target is to create a market-driven mechanism to promote expansion and private investment, again, based on sustainable practices. And what is the mechanism? Well, the mechanism is voluntary certification of biofuel producers based on life cycle assessment. This is a very key component, the life cycle assessment, because essentially if you want to measure things in this area, you have 2 ways of doing it. You have the well to wheel, birth to term, or life cycle assessment on one side. And the other way is the tank to wheel. What's the difference? Well, the tank to wheel, people in countries that believe tank to wheel is acceptable, they accept, for instance, options like electrification based on batteries, where the electricity comes from burning coal. And they think they're doing well because they're driving a car in London, Berkeley Square, because it's electric, and they're not emitting any emissions for global warming. But they're burning coal 100 miles away, to feed that electric car. That is tank to wheel, because they're looking only from the tank of the refueling station to the wheel. What matters really, scientifically way, is the well to wheel. When you take into account all the consequences involved, where the source of energy comes from, all the energy used in building the cars, replacing the spare parts, including the batteries and everything else, the infrastructure involved, that's called the life cycle assessment. It's regulated and it's normatized by ISO. Everybody knows what it's about. Okay? But this voluntary certification of RenovaBio is based on life cycle assessment, which will determine the grade each biofuel producer will receive in terms of its energy environmental efficiency based on life cycle assessment. And this grade will entitle each biofuel producer to issue or to request the issuance of a decarbonization credit, which is going to be issued by whom? By a financial institution. It has to be by a financial institution for it to become an asset tradable worldwide. Otherwise, it would not be. And all this will be regulated by targets set by the government in the long term. And the size of the target will determine the size of the market for biofuels. And then leave the biofuels to compete with each other. The most efficient biofuels will win. And the most efficient biofuel producers will make more money. How does the grading system work? Well, we're measuring energy efficiency and environmental impact. How do we measure energy efficiency? In megajoule per cubic meter or megajoule per ton of biofuel. How do you measure environmental efficiency, environmental impact? Grams of CO2 equivalent per cubic meter. The highest megajoule per cubic meter, the better. The least, the lowest, the grams of CO2 per cubic meter, the better. Oh, you see cubic meter twice. Let's get rid of it. Divide one by the other. Take cubic meter out. We're left with a fraction, which is grams of CO2 per megajoule. The lower, the better. And then we compare this grade with the reference number for fossil fuels. For instance, gasoline is 87.4 grams of CO2 per megajoule. For diesel, it's 86.5. The difference is the grade. And this difference multiplied by the volume sold gives the entitlement of the biofuel producer to sell or to request the issuance of a decarbonization credit. RenovaBio then establishes a market-driven carbon pricing mechanism, with endogenous determination of the value of carbon, not the exogenous determination. We don't want the Minister of Treasury, Dr. Marcio Fortes, setting up the price of carbon. We don't want the pen. We want the market to set that. It's much more efficient. Why? Because over time, as people become more efficient, the price of carbon will come down. Okay? We want to unleash market forces to implement innovation and investments. We want to stimulate demand growth independent of mandates. This is very important. And we don't want to predefine champions. We want to promote expansion based on meritocracy. And what is the basis for all this? Well, the basis is the fact that Brazil has already a distribution system for biofuels in a country which is continental size, already blending 27% anhydrous ethanol in all gasoline, already distributing hydrous alcohol in almost 42,000 retailing stations, over 60,000 hoses selling hydrous alcohol. We had 10% biodiesel in the whole country, going towards 15. And what is biofuels at the end? Biofuels are solar energy captured, stored, and distributed in an efficient, economical, and safe manner. Most of all, it's hydrogen captured, stored, and distributed in an efficient, economic, and safe manner. Think about ethanol and biofuels in general as solar energy or hydrogen in an envelope, sold in a safe manner, clean, easy, economical, without the problems of distributing hydrogen in titanium tanks, without the problems of having to establish a distribution system for electricity. Congressman Jardine, a refueling station able to refuel 10 electric cars simultaneously would require an installation of 4 megawatts. Imagine a network of fueling stations, 4 megawatts each. What would be the cost of it? So the objective of RenovaBio is what? Essentially recover the ability of the country to invest again in biofuels. Invest not only in capacity, in scale, but invest in quality. Invest in efficiency to lower costs, and by lowering costs to lower price at the consumer level. We have estimated that if we simply recover the productivity lost between 2010 and 2017, the cost would fall by 19.4%. And if we continue to evolve at the same rate that we were developing in the first decade of the century, of the millennium, we could, in 5 to 10 years, reach a reduction of 29.0% in cost and therefore price. By doing what? By rewarding those who do right and not punishing those who do wrong. By having a market-driven carbon pricing mechanism and stimulating investment in promoting efficiency in biofuel and bioenergy production. What has been the chronology of Debevoise? Well, this idea was launched in December 2016. By February 2017, the directives were submitted for public consultation. Well, they were approved by the National Council on Energy Policy in June last year. And between June and November, a big effort was done to construct a legislative proposal, which at the end was presented in Congress in Brazil on November 14th by Congressman Vander Bussi. In 12 days, it was approved in the lower house. In another 12 days, approved in the Senate by urgency, voted by very large proportion of congressmen, and enacted as public law 13576 by President Temer in December 26, then regulated by a decree March 14 in Ribeirão Preto, again signed by President Temer in Ribeirão Preto in a big ceremony at the opening of the ground. And now we are in the phase where the committee, Panelists, has already produced a proposed target, which is in public consultation again. What is Panelists doing? It's simultaneously addressing policy objectives in energy, environmental, agriculture, industry, social, and economic development, economic reform. It is Brazil's strategy to enable Brazil to comply with the energy, with the climate agreement commitments. And it's based on the belief that market forces should drive the choice of the most efficient option towards environmental energy efficiency in fuel production. What is behind this? It's the belief that we can move from the current option of the internal combustion engine using fossil fuels, which is low in energy efficiency and it's high in emissions of greenhouse gases, and we can move towards a more efficient, lower energy consumption condition and lower emissions. How do we simplify this? This histogram shows that today the internal combustion engine using gasoline is emitting 166 grams of CO2 per kilometer. By 2030, it's expected to reduce to 135. The hybrid cars using gasoline are emitting today 144, going towards 104. The electric car in Europe and the US is at 139, going towards 82. The combination of ethanol and gasoline in Brazil using internal combustion engine is at 129, better than the electric car, going towards 80. The internal combustion engine using ethanol today in Brazil is 45, which is 1/3 of the electric car, going towards 20. The hybrid using ethanol today is at 23, which is 1/6 of the electric car, going towards 14. And the fuel cell is at 11. So we're going towards this blue arrow, and we want to reach the most efficient condition, which is the fuel cell using ethanol. We want to do this without mandates, without subsidies, And the target, which has been submitted this past Friday for public consultation, is there. It's a target to reduce carbon intensity by 10%. I mentioned that gasoline's intensity is 87.4 because of the use already that we have in Brazil, biofuels. We are today at 74.65. We want to reduce another 10%. By doing that, as you can see, in the auto cycle market, the plan is for gasoline A to move from 31 to 30 billion liters in 10 years. Total ethanol consumption to grow from 26.7 to 47.1 billion liters. Diesel, pure diesel, to move from 51 to 62.8. Biodiesel from 5.7 to 11.1. Biomethane to occupy 10% of the compressed natural gas market. And biojet fuel to start making a dent with 360 million liters. I invite you to continue the discussion tomorrow at our conference. For the 12th year, we're holding Sugar Ethanol Conference in New York. This year is the Santander ISO International Sugar Organization Target Conference at the Hilton, and you can register through the website. Thank you.
Thank you. You need the help of Roberto Ardengue, please. Eu vou falar em português e o Roberto vai me ajudar um pouco aqui.
I speak in Portuguese and he will going to help me here.
Uma alegria muito grande poder estar aqui. Eu estou feliz de poder comemorar o meu aniversário com vocês aqui, por uma boa causa e com um público tão interessante como as pessoas que aqui estão. Agradeço muito à Câmara de Comércio pela iniciativa e o privilégio de compor esta mesa que aqui está.
I'm very happy to be here today, the day of my anniversary, my birthday, and to be member of this selected group of panelists in this morning. Thank you.
Agradecer muito ao embaixador Enio, que está aqui conosco, a você, Roberto Ardengue, ao nosso deputado federal, Márcio Fortes, que está aqui, e toda a Câmara de Comércio aqui juntos.
Also to thank Ambassador Enio Cordeiro, Roberto Ardengue, and Congressman Márcio Fortes and the Chamber of Commerce for this organizing this event.
A minha missão aqui ficou muito facilitada, eu posso ser bem objetivo aqui, por conta das competentes e qualificadas intervenções. Primeiro, do Joel Velasco.
Yes, my mission here is very easy right now, especially after the presentation of the Joel Velasco.
E daquilo que foi a formulação, o conceito apresentado a todos nós aqui pelo nosso querido Plínio Nastari, que mais do que alguém que compõe hoje o Conselho Nacional de Política Energética, foi o grande inspirador do RenovaBio.
And also by the presentation of Dr. Plínio Nastari, that he is a reference in the sector, not also a member of the National Energy Policy Council, but also inspiration for this new legislation of the RenovaBio.
Essas planilhas iniciais são algumas que eu até vou repetir, algumas que o Joel utilizou, que dão a ideia do tamanho da cadeia da cana-de-açúcar no Brasil.
Those slides that I'm going to start showing to you right now, and sometimes they may repeat some of the information I have already received, but they give you an idea of the supply chain of the ethanol sugar industry in Brazil.
E queria destacar 4 questões básicas. O que é o nosso modelo que produz, a partir da cana-de-açúcar, alimento, combustível e eletricidade, o perfil de renovação e inovação constante e aquilo que é o compromisso com a sustentabilidade.
And also I'm going to stress the model, that's a fuel and electricity model, and also the sustainability aspect of this policy.
De uma lavoura que começa produzindo açúcar, hoje nós produzimos energia, energia elétrica, combustível, e há também uma gama cada vez maior de produção e de utilização na indústria química dos derivados de cana-de-açúcar.
As you can see, we start as an agricultural product, but it has a lot of by-products. As you can see, you can produce energy and other chemicals and products that come from this original agricultural product.
O nosso desenvolvimento da indústria é muito veloz, teve etapas que passaram por uma desregulamentação, o conceito de você passar a utilizar o combustível de uma forma flexível, e isso tudo nos levou a chegar nesse instante. Essa planilha havia sido mostrada, inclusive, pelo Joel Velasco.
We have different stages on this policy. We have some time that we have a lot of regulation and intervention, but this market is going more and more in a more free way to develop.
Nós vivemos um momento delicado hoje, todos vocês estão acompanhando. Esta semana, hoje, está pontuada aqui em Nova York de negociações. O ponto mais relevante será um encontro que o Plínio se referiu amanhã, por ele organizado, mas nós estamos vivendo um momento muito delicado de preço do açúcar, o que está fazendo com que todo esse setor tenha um desafio aí muito forte pelos próximos 2 anos.
We are living right now a very difficult moment for this industry, especially because of the price, the low price of the sugar. And tomorrow we will have also the opportunity to discuss this issue, and there are negotiations going on. And the event tomorrow is also going to be an opportunity for us to understand what's happening.
De qualquer forma, uma coisa fundamental para nós é aquilo que tem significado o etanol. Hoje nós temos uma mistura obrigatória no Brasil de 27% do etanol na gasolina e uma venda direta do próprio etanol como combustível.
So, but what's important right now in Brazil that we have two different ways of selling ethanol in Brazil. One is to mix with gasoline, and there is 27% of ethanol mixed with the Brazilian gasoline today, and also you can have also the access to 100% ethanol in the Brazilian gas stations.
Essa planilha particularmente é muito importante porque demonstra que a adesão ao combustível, a utilização de combustível de uma forma flexível é algo que deixou de ser opção de uma ou de outra marca, mas hoje é uma opção de toda a indústria automobilística.
As you can see in this slide, the use of flex fuels in the Brazilian automotive industry is widespread in every industries and companies that produce cars in Brazil. This is a technology that has already been consistently used.
E seja uma reflexão importante, algo aconteceu.
Eric, we have something popping up on our screen.
Pode continuar.
Yeah.
Mas vamos continuar enquanto isso, né? Quer dizer, teve um problema da interrupção. Para nós, a questão da eletrificação dos carros elétricos, essa vertente que vem agora é muito importante, porque por conta de uma opção que algumas empresas já fizeram para compor os carros híbridos ou o processo de célula combustíveis. O Plínio havia destacado isso com a utilização de biocombustíveis.
So we have this discussion right now about the electric cars, but also I have other options like the cells, combustion cells that can be used also in the cars.
Eu estou passando muito rapidamente porque eu acho que essas questões foram bem colocadas pelo Plínio e pelo Joel aqui, mas aqui também uma localização geográfica no Brasil dos polos de produção.
So I'm going fast because some of the aspects have already been raised by Plínio, but this slide shows the geographical placement of the main producing areas in Brazil.
A destacar a questão então da inovação como uma questão de compromisso muito importante. Aqui, ontem, nós tivemos uma discussão no consulado e, num determinado instante, vamos entrar nas questões mais diretamente polêmicas aqui. Foi perguntado, mas esse processo é um processo de lunch free?
So yesterday we had the opportunity to have a discussions in the consulate about all of those issues, and during the Q&A sessions we have a question regarding is this really a free lunch process?
E por isso que eu acho que esta primeira aqui planilha é algo que nos faz caminhar nesse sentido. Quer dizer, a curva de aprendizado, ganhos de eficiência tornam totalmente equilibrada esta proposta que tem o nosso entusiasmo.
So this slide shows very much how innovation, how this increase of knowledge will happen, and in this sector that shows you how good has been the improvement we have made over the years.
Aqui diz das iniciativas que nós temos tido no etanol de segunda geração, que é uma das referências feitas, que é a utilização da celulose como base de produção do etanol.
So here we can see also the second generation of this industry is the use of the bagasse to produce more ethanol from the traditional use. So we call this the second generation of the industry.
Aqui é a redução efetiva de custos que nós temos observado.
This is, shows also how we have managed to decrease the cost of this sector, this industry.
E aqui um item que é decisivo, que é exatamente de uma produção inicial que nós tínhamos de 3.000 litros por hectare, tá certo? Nós estamos chegando e caminhando para 7.000 litros por hectare. Eu acho que é um dado que fala por si.
So we can see with this slide that we have made a lot of improvements in the productivity. For instance, we have reached a historical number of 3,000 liters per hectare, and now we got 7,000 liters per hectare.
Uma referência agora à questão da sustentabilidade como um compromisso do setor.
Also, I like to raise this question of the sustainability aspect of this sector.
Essa planilha, o Márcio Fortes guarda ela no seu celular, me mostrou ontem, o Joel mostrou, eu repito aqui, daquilo que é no Brasil, o que nós ocupamos com a produção agrícola, que é 7%, segundo a NASA, 7,6%, levantamento feito pela NASA, e nós temos esse grau ainda de preservação de florestas naturais que é inigualável entre os países desenvolvidos e em desenvolvimento do mundo.
So we can see with this slide, Marcio Felix and Velasco have those numbers also on hand. According to the numbers, included by NASA, only 7 to 7.6% of the Brazilian land is used for agriculture.
Aqui alguns conceitos também e certificações internacionais que temos obtido no que diz respeito a boas práticas agrícolas também, que é um compromisso rigoroso da legislação no Brasil. Nós temos uma legislação de preservação que é das mais rigorosas no mundo e um intenso uso de boas práticas agrícolas.
So we have also in Brazil a very strict regulation regarding the best practice, and these practices have been assessed and certified by different international organizations.
Mas aqui é que eu paro e talvez seja a contribuição que eu possa mais efetivamente dar aqui como um testemunho, falando em nome da Câmara dos Deputados do Brasil.
And but at this point, I'd like also to make a stop and mention this program. And this is the contribution that I can maybe make today as a member of the Brazilian lower house.
Todas as pessoas que aqui estão se interessam pelo Brasil, negociam com o Brasil, lidam com o Brasil, eu bem sei.
So we have an audience here of people that knew Brazil, they do deals with Brazil, they follow what's happening in Brazil.
mas eu queria assegurar algumas coisas, me permitam.
But
Primeiro,
I'd like to make sure a point on this aspect.
Primeiro, assegurar que nós vivemos um momento de instituições absolutamente consolidadas no Brasil.
First, that we live in Brazil in a moment that very stable institutions.
Nós temos um ex-presidente da República preso, que ainda goza de popularidade por conta da sua postura populista que tem, e isso não traz nenhum constrangimento e nenhuma perturbação ao país.
So we have right now a president that is in jail, and this creates no kind of a shaming or prejudice in Brazil.
Nós estamos às vésperas de uma eleição geral no Brasil e vocês estejam certos, tomo licença de fazer essa previsão, de que emergirá um governo de centro e equilibrado com uma ampla maioria no Brasil.
And we are in the eve of general election in Brazil, but we can be certain that the outcome of this process is going to be a very centered and reasonable government that is going to be elected in the country.
Nós começamos um processo de mudanças estruturais no Brasil, ainda inicial, e isto é um compromisso que vai continuar no cenário pós-eleição, porque é uma exigência da sociedade brasileira, independente de quem seja eleito.
So we have started in Brazil a process of supporting and becoming more stable in terms of institutions, and there is no way that this process is going to be stopped after the election.
Isso não é uma declaração de fé minha, nem de torcida particular. É algo que está fundamentado naquilo que é um movimento hoje que toda a sociedade faz de uma forma efetiva.
That's not just my wishful thinking, but it's also a kind of trend that you can perceive in the whole Brazilian society.
O RenovaBio é uma expressão dentro disso. Eu não vou entrar no detalhe porque foi muito bem exposto pelo Dr. Plínio, a conjuntura da opção também foi dita pelo João Velasco, mas ter políticas perenes, estáveis, de médio e longo prazo é algo que o RenovaBio reflete e que vai se desdobrar em outros segmentos da nossa atividade econômica.
So RenovaBio is just one example of this new trend in which we have stable and long-term policies to Brazil.
Uma questão muito importante é que o RenovaBio, que é uma nova cultura, forma de encarar a questão dos combustíveis, ele rompe com uma utilização que por dezenas de anos foi feita da Petrobras, quando nós tivemos uma manipulação artificial de preços de combustível no Brasil pela política da Petrobras.
And also RenovaBio, for you to understand, also breaks a system we had in Brazil in which Petrobras has allowed to fix the price for any fuels in Brazil.
Isso permite que as energias renováveis deixem de ser uma oposição aos combustíveis e à energia fóssil, aos combustíveis de origem fóssil, e passem a ter uma complementariedade muito importante.
And also the systems allow that the biofuels they have a situation in which they are going to be complementing and not just to take against the normal fuels, but also a complementary policy in Brazil.
Virá um mercado do chamado CBIO, que é, no nosso entender, algo que poderá ser referência, inclusive internacional, desde o protocolo de Kyoto, que o mundo busca algum mecanismo que possa negociar e ser transacionado nesse processo que é internacionalmente estabelecido de busca de redução de emissão de gases de efeito estufa.
So you have this CBIO certificate that is going to be a landmark in this process that has been discussed since the Kyoto Convention, to have a system in which you can decrease the greenhouse effects, and this is one landmark for this trend.
Além disso, terá também desdobramento na consolidação de mercados de contratos futuros de fornecimento de etanol.
And also this will help a lot that we develop a future markets for ethanol.
Portanto, uma mudança cultural que se encontra perfeitamente enquadrada. Foi por conta disso a tramitação rápida e convergente que se estabeleceu no Congresso Nacional de uma política que veio para ficar de médio e longo prazo.
That's why we have a very easy process of approval of this bill in the Congress for this policy that is really having a long-term approach for the area.
O que nos faz imaginar que isso se desdobrará em investimentos significativos nessa cadeia, tá certo? Tendo um desdobramento importante do ponto de vista de recursos, e nós temos áreas disponíveis para ampliar de uma forma significativa a produção de cana-de-açúcar sem nenhum problema ambiental, sem nenhuma ofensa ao bioma amazônico ou do Pantanal.
So we can anticipate that also this new legislation will trigger a lot of investments in Brazil. We have a lot of lands available, and also there is no way that we can use lands in the Amazon area for this increase of sugarcane production.
Muito obrigado a todos.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I think this was actually a very good segue into some of the legal and what I would call financial investment opportunities and issues that I will actually ask Salvatore to start off with, given that we've now heard from our panelists about the highly capital-intensive nature and the long-term nature of some of these investments, and how some of these new items will be coming down the line. What have you been seeing as the most common issues with respect to sugar and ethanol mills and the issues they've been having, and how have they been dealing with them?
For the question, Jasmine, I would like to thank you, the Debevoise and the Brazilian American Chamber, for organizing this panel, the attendees, and it's an honor for me to be here with you panelists, the Pope of the industry, Mr. Nastari, and Congressman Jasmine. And also it's an honor to be here hearing from you how the Renova Bio can be or represent the fresh air for the industry. So, although we have been discussing about positive aspects of the industry, I'll try to be very objective, Jasmine, and consolidate my question, the question that I sent to you, so we'll leave room for people asking questions to us. I've been involved with this industry in the turnaround financial restructuring space for many years. I'm Italian. I first arrived in Brazil in '98. I remember I worked for an investment bank, and the first engagement they asked me to take care of was a distressed sugar and ethanol mill. So I've been for a very long time involved in the flip side of the industry, Plinio, where family business somehow with poor preparation, notwithstanding the greatness of the industry, the potential of the industry, have been surfing waves. So the first wave of a great development of the industry during the second part of 2000, now the possibility of the Renova Bio, but we have always elements or players that for many reasons have been falling in distress. So this must be addressed. The positive thing of the distress is that this may represent an opportunity for the industry to consolidate, because you can comment on that, scale matters in the industry, and second, because the industry needs capital, so you can have a cycle of distressed investors coming, buying cheap, and then fostering the consolidation. So The reason of the crisis, despite we always hear from entrepreneurs, hey, the crisis, the volatility, the effects, you see when you go in depth in the details that you have a number of family business that pretty much unprepared. This is not a critic, but a criticism, in the sense that they overinvested with an unbalanced balance sheet, maybe using short-term financing borrowed in the international market or even in the local market to invest in capex. Lack of control, which eventually means for a commodity-based business also not proper aging procedures or cash discipline, and most of all, we can peg all of this I'm mentioning as a governance in the holistic sense of the governance, of course. This has led over the past years in turn in less capex in the bioasset, which is the core of this business. You can have a state-of-the-art industry with whatever machine you think you can buy in the market, but then if you don't have a proper capex devoted to the bioasset, you don't have yields to foster your productivity, to produce a lower cost, and so on and so forth. Those guys that invested poorly in the bioassets started also having problem with their strategic partners, and most of the time strategic partner for this industry are the agri partners, so the ones that lease lands to cultivate sugarcane, or the ones that provide sugarcane to those industries, which in turn became a problem of breaking up contracts with those guys. So if you start breaking up contracts with those guys, you start losing sugarcane. So we have seen important economic groups in the industry losing sugarcane, reducing the possibility of crushing, operating at lower levels of even break-even point, and starting defaulting in local loans or international loans. So some numbers, which again, Congressman, it's not a critic, but it's something that we need to face to see how to address those problems, of course. We have seen over the past years 50 mills closing, 52 in judicial recovery, which correspond to local Chapter 11, and 27 in bankruptcy liquidation, which correspond to Chapter 7 in Brazil. But as I mentioned to you, this has also been, a great opportunity for the consolidation of the industry, as well as for investors coming, investing cheap, and then flipping this to strategic investors. So we have seen a big new industry of non-performing loans related to the industry coming to the market. So financial institutions, international investors selling their loans cheap for someone to buy, consolidate, and eventually swapping this into equity. We have been participating in turnarounds of investors that implemented those type of strategies in Brazil, as well as investors specialized in distressed situation that acquired cheap the bonds of many companies in Brazil, issuing bonds during the booming cycle, and now trying to restructure. So, having said that, and looking at the positive aspect of what I'm also telling you, I see that there is always for this industry, and for the reason you mentioned before, a great light at the end of the tunnel. The solution for those that fall into this situation of distress, in my view, is consolidation. So we open up a market of M&A, distressed M&A possibility, where those guys either disappear because their sugar cane has been absorbed by largest competitors, or consolidate into largest groups. For this to happen, we have seen critical key points. First of all, good faith of the shareholders that acknowledge they are in crisis, and so avoid to put obstacles to the restructuring first, sell of the asset second, and maybe preserving some of their own estate also. Second, it's important for distressed investors to be quick in materializing this type of strategies, buying, turn around, and then selling, because we are talking about living businesses. So bio assets is a living business. If it takes 2 years to conclude an M&A transaction, you run the risk to lose agri partners, the sugar cane, and then even if you buy cheap, you run the risk of an impossible turnaround, to face an impossible turnaround. The third, and not irrelevant point, is of course transparent and discipline. Transparency at the moment you enter in these processes, either out of court or in court transactions. And for this, it's important also to bring in advisors or people that first know very well about the industry from operational standpoints, how to overcome succession risk if there are many, potentially from a fiscal or labor standpoints and environmental standpoints. And last but not least, having a group of interim managers that take over from inception and avoid disruption at operation. So my message here is I'm by nature positive, as you are, Plinio and Congressman Jardine. So I believe RenovaBio can bring a fresh air for the industry, and also a fresh air for the distressed zone of the industry, where consolidation is a must in order to create, from financial standpoints, very strong group for the future.
Thank you, Salvatore. A follow-on question from that, which I will address to Alexandre. Given that there actually are a number of Brazilian investors and foreign investors who have a lot of positive views about Brazil and want to actually invest in Brazil and are looking at this industry, what would you say is things that the investors have to think about with respect to structuring, and how you would structure coming into the industry, particularly if you're worried about some of the distressed?
Sure. First of all, I would like to thank all the attendees and all the panelists. I will try to shorten my speech, of course, to allow everyone to speak for at least a few minutes. So thank you, guys. And I think that Salvatore mentioned the most critical things for an investor to be aware of. Nowadays, and Salvatore mentioned very large numbers of sugarcane mills under RG process, so Chapter 11 processes. Chapter 11 can be a solution to increase value of a sugarcane mill asset. And why is that? The reason is that the law provides for mechanisms to allow possible purchasers to get rid of succession risk. So by forming a new PI, which is a very broad concept brought by the law, which is a kind of an independent operating entity receiving all sorts of assets, so permits, movable assets, land, and becoming a living mechanism. And this living mechanism will be then sold without succession risk, so allowing possible purchaser to effectively consolidate the market. And we could see in the market very recently several acquisitions in the form of UPI, and also several other transactions that end up not being concluded because of the succession risk. So we are now dealing with, for instance, a very large multinational group that had an offer for a very strong sugar and ethanol player, that after discovering lots of succession risk and all, as well as knowing that part of the sister company was somehow involved in the Lava Jato case, decided to step out of the table. So one of the things that investors should know is that Brazilian law and Brazilian bankruptcy law under the RJ process allows investors to acquire assets with a very mitigated risk assessment. So we can build a new PI, acquire it, build it with whatever asset, permits, even special regimes by means of construction of a reorg plan, duly construed in a way that would allow investors to effectively take it and run it in the proper way. So I think that summarizing very much my speech here, again to allow everyone to speak, there are very decent and very proactive and fast ways to allow this consolidation that Salvatore says, and I agree with him, is probably the light in the end of the tunnel.
Thank you, Alexandre. As you, since you mentioned the Lava Jato case, which has actually concerned various foreign investors, and we are looking at a more stable process going forward with the new elections, and that, Daniel, what do you think when you're talking to foreign investors about kind of the best ways to think about mitigating risks that they're worried about that may not be there, just making sure they do the diligence? How would you advise?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. So fighting corruption has been a key endeavor for U.S. authorities for decades, and it's certainly become a top priority for Brazilian authorities as well in the last few years. Not only are authorities in these countries particularly aggressive when it comes to tackling corruption, but we've also seen unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination among them. This explains the increase in the number of multi-jurisdictional enforcement actions and resolutions that we've been seeing. And these trends are here to stay. The consequences of being implicated in corruption are potentially devastating, and companies should certainly be aware of this and take action to try and deter, detect, and address those issues. There are different ways to do so. So particularly in the context of a transaction, if say an investor is looking to do business in Brazil, one way to do that is to try and structure your transaction in a way that mitigates these risks. So for instance, under US law on the successor liability, it may, that's not necessarily always the case, be safer for companies to acquire stock or assets of a target than it is to merge with a target. Because if you merge with a target, then you're acquiring all sorts of liabilities. There's also a range of contractual protections that can be inserted in contracts. Just to name a few examples here, you can insert broadly worded, backward and forward-looking representations and covenants. You could seek continued access to conduct due diligence between signing and closing. If there's limited access to information pre-signing, you could insert indemnities in your contract, and you could look for termination rights as well in the event that any issues are to emerge down the line.
Thanks, Daniel. And I'll say that from a U.S. restructuring perspective, similar to Alexandre, I'd say that there are structuring options to think about as with respect to mergers and sales that also involve either bankruptcy in the U.S. or a concurrent filing in the U.S. that assists with a Brazilian type filing to actually move things away. Given the panel that we have in front of us and the very interesting things that the panel has been saying, I thought I'd open it up for questions, and that includes questions among panelists, if the panelists would like to ask each other questions, but questions from the audience as well for any of the panelists about the discussion so far.
Jasmine, I have a question for Mr. Nastari. Plinio, I've been in Brazil for 18 years. I've been following the sector as a corporate financier in turnaround mainly. And I believe that we are set up at this point in time in a situation where family business need to decide what to do instead of procrastinating, you know, their agony. Do you believe that we can strengthen the sector with a wave of consolidation of all of these guys that are somehow in agony? Because RJ is agony. You need credit, you need loans from international local banks, and you cannot access that. What's your opinion on that? And if this is somehow interesting for the Renovabio being interested for those guys also.
Thank you very much, Salvatore. Very quickly, the answer, I think it's one by one case analysis. Consolidation not necessarily brings more efficiency. You have, of course, economies of scale in some areas, but there are ample examples in the industry where you have smaller groups which are equally or more efficient than larger groups. Let's recall that in spite of all the foreclosures and all the RJs and all that, we have not seen a fall in crushing of cane. So the cane has moved to somebody else. Somebody else is crushing that cane, even though the company may have closed or interrupted temporarily its operations. So there are cases, and they are public. I can mention two recent cases, which are the João Lira mills in Minas Gerais. They were still well maintained in very good areas for agronomical terms, and they were sold. People who bought these mills were very happy, and they're going to return. There are other cases that there's no chance that they can return. So it's one by one case. There are other mills which are on the table at this moment, and we have some perspectives on those cases. What should a mill do, or the industry do at this moment? First of all, Renovabio should not be seen as a pot of gold which suddenly has fallen from everybody's lap. It's not a pack of money that has suddenly appeared. It's not the solution in the short term, but for everybody who's in this industry for a long time and have a long-term commitment to the industry, it's a big, big change. Because for the first time, you have an opportunity for bringing value for those who are doing things right or better, and capturing value. So it's the first time where you have what economists have always fought for, which is the internalization into price of the externalities. Okay? So it's the first time you have that happen. In the short term, the industry has a lot of challenges still. The challenge of India going from 20.4 to 31.5 million tons in 1 year. Thailand going from 10.03 to 14.7 million tons. Europe going from 16.6 to 21.2 and repeating again 21 next year. India with the perspective of repeating 31, 32 next year. Well, unless we have the producer of feedstocks being sensible and being affected by price, we won't see a change in this situation. And certainly the governments of countries like India, Thailand, Europe, will suddenly find themselves in a deadlock because they suddenly will find themselves in a big glut domestically as well. Are there solutions? Yes, there are. And amazingly, it's in the bioenergy sector. India has a crazy system in which the government sets the price of cane, obliges the mills to crush all the cane that has been produced. Prices of sugar domestically are free, and then mills don't have the money to pay the farmers. Then the government gives the money for the mills to pay the farmers. And then sets, this year, a mandatory quota for exports. So indirectly, the money that is being given to the mills is to support the exports, which are mandatory. But more, they oblige the mills not to produce ethanol unless they produce ethanol only from molasses. They do not allow production of ethanol from cane juice. Doesn't make sense. They have to allow conversion of cane from cane juice to ethanol. Why? Because they're big importers of gasoline and diesel. So how is the way out? We have to explain India. Oh, you want to support the 53 million farmers of cane? Okay. But do that to avoid gasoline imports and diesel imports, not mess up the whole sugar market. Same thing, Thailand. Well, Thailand was doing wrong. Brazil went there, started to speak to them. They corrected their system, and I think we are in a move to a solution. But still, sugar market is a big, distorted market by protected markets all over Europe, US, China, Japan, and pretty much there are very few producers which are sensitive and they receive the effects of the free market condition. This is the problem that we have to address. What is the opportunity? The opportunity is that we have a big structural problem of global warming. 20 countries that represent over 60% of world population, which are gathered around the BioFuture platform, made a declaration of vision at COP23 in Bonn this past December, saying that for us to reach the 2-degree scenario, that is to limit global warming to 2 degrees, we have to, 1, double the proportion of bioenergy in world demand by 2030. 2030 is tomorrow. It's like planning your weekend. And you have to triple the proportion of biofuels in energy demand by 2030. We have a sense of urgency around the world on this matter. And this is being supported by the International Energy Agency and the International Renewable Energy Agency. So what should a producer do in Brazil? More than buying the neighbor, probably he should be looking inside his company and trying to make ways of reducing steam consumption, make more cogen, do biodigestion, substitute all his diesel with biomethane, increase the megajoule per cubic meter. And when he does that, he's going to produce cheaper ethanol, which is going, by competition, to be available cheaper to the consumer. That's the solution. Then we'll start seeing investment again, and we'll see that stagnant supply curve that I showed to grow again in a more sustainable way than what had happened in the past. So I think this is the solution. In the meantime, some mills will be bought because they're in good location, they're well maintained, and some will simply disappear.
Thank you.
So when you're thinking about which mills to buy and looking at how you do that diligence, Daniel, what do you think about doing diligence and thinking about compliance and diligence in that aspect?
Certainly. So I mentioned contractual management of risks as being an important part of the process before. It's certainly the most exciting part of the process for many of you here. There are other equally important, though maybe less interesting portions of this process that investors should be mindful of as well. One of them is conducting a proper, thorough, risk-based due diligence on the target before making an investment. The goal of this process is really to assess the true value of the target and of its assets, which may be impacted by corruption, if any exists, to identify and to understand any risks that there may be, and to think of ways to address them in the contracts, as I discussed before, as well as to come up with a post-acquisition plan. Now, there are a number of risks that investors should be mindful of in coming up with and devising this plan. Geographical risks based on where the target is located and conducts its business, operational risks based on the industry in which the target operates, its customers, its interactions with government officials, its reliance on third parties, historical risks as well, based on known and suspected issues involving the target, its affiliates, its executives, and its business partners, and compliance issues based on the adequacy or inadequacy of the target's compliance program. Compliance is also a very important part of this process. Companies want to make sure that they have a tailor-made compliance program in place, one that isn't just a paper program, one that is adhered to by executives and employees and business partners. There is no one-size-fits-all model when it comes to compliance programs, and I believe it's acknowledged that they can't be and won't be absolutely bulletproof, but they should be robust and they should be built around certain pillars that you see in most successful compliance programs. So you will have a dedicated compliance officer or manager who has the resources and the autonomy to do his or her job. You will have strong, periodically updated, accessible policies, procedures, and controls. You have the commitment of management and the board of directors, ongoing training, periodic risk assessments, and mechanisms to report anonymously on issues and to investigate them fairly and thoroughly and address them as the case may be. And this is not only for companies that are already operating, regardless of whether they want to be sold or to enter into deals with other companies, but also is an important consideration from the perspective of investors. Once you do your investment, you want to make sure you do what's called integration as soon as possible, which is basically ensuring that the target has a proper compliance program in place, that folks who interact with government officials are given proper training, and that relationships with third parties are reviewed and contracts with them are amended as needed to basically strengthen the anti-corruption protections that they have.
Thanks, Daniel. And I believe also if you think about this panel, you'll have legal compliance and legal structuring, as well as looking at some assets. And then you actually have Dr. Nastari here also, who can actually talk about the business aspects of the compliance issues and the business aspects of doing diligence on these types of sugar businesses. Now, before I close out, are there any questions from the panel? Yes.
I would like only ask Mr. Natari and Congressman Garin to value and emphasize that we are now here talking. This issue is now supported by a law, not only government acts or resolutions from Central Bank or IRS. So for everybody, laws are permanent, are sure, okay? The Real Plan was successful because it was a law in the past. The imprisonment of Mr. Lula and the others about 200 people due to car wash operations are done because they are based on a law from 2013, voted by the Congress. So the same Congress that arrests people because of the law makes the law for the issue we are today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marcio Fortes. You're absolutely right. The Renova Bio legislation in the lower house of the Câmara dos Deputados was approved by 299 votes in favor and only 9 against. And at the Senate, it was approved by acclamation. In both houses, it was voted by urgency decision of all members, as I mentioned, in 12 days in each house. And not only in Congress. Congress reflected what happened in the society. During the process of formulation of Renova Bio, there was a lot of dialogue. And the President and the Minister of Mines and Energy, and I know this because he presides the council, which I'm a member of, received 54 different letters of support from the most important representatives of the economic spectrum of Brazil supporting this concept. So there's no question that Renova Bio has a strong support of the society. There are implementation risks and issues, of course. In implementation, implementation should be inclusive, not excluding. It should be inducive of people to become more efficient. But I think we're moving towards the right direction for the first time in 43 years in biofuels. And that's what, as we were talking in the coffee break, I think we need more in Brazil. More examples of Renova Bio, as was mentioned by Congressman Jardim. Because if we look at what happened in Brazil the past decades, we had a system of a lot of government intervention. And because of the Constitution of '88, because of that Article 174, which restricts the intervention of the government in the economic domain, a lot of this intervention fell back. But we did not construct the needed regulation of the markets to organize things in a simple way to leave market forces to work towards efficiency in their own ways without government interference. And the lack of regulation is what invites governments to intervene in markets. So we want to establish regulations like this in other areas. You know what's happening. Minister of Treasury, Ministério da Fazenda in Brazil, now they want to apply Renova Bio to other areas. They want to apply to electricity. They're discussing this, which is fine. Why? Because as we mentioned here, we need business-oriented things. We need to reward people who are doing good management. And there are in Brazil people involved with this, doing due diligences in the right way. Tatawa is one of them. We provide due diligence services. We're the biggest one. We have also a company that provides operational rating to support management and assess in a rating system operational companies. Financial rating looks at what happened in the past. Operational rating looks at what's going to happen in the future. You know, there are systems in place, independent, auditing, ready to help investments in this area.
Nevertheless, the government changes.
Regardless the change in government.
But no, yeah, right, because you are right, and also this is all in favor of the possibility of raising additional money in the markets and being able, for instance, to give more security to the investors that needs to put money to invest in increase of efficiency, increase of the power of the sugarcane plants, increase of the productivity of the sugarcane fields. And for that, we need also to give security to the investors by means of changing some of the situations that we are facing nowadays, such as, for instance, limitation on the possibility to give lands as collateral, or even, sometimes confusing decisions out of the judiciary, of the Brazilian judiciary courts, disregarding or somehow limiting the enforcement of collaterals, because it's all about credibility at the end, right? So,
Transparency.
yeah, of course.
Complemento ligeiro só aí, Arden, me ajude, por favor, é que há outra norma que está prestes a ser consolidada no Brasil, que é a Rota 2030, que também, na busca de eficiência, particularmente dos motores, dos veículos, será complementar, estratégico para isso.
This is another point that I'd like to make, that there is another piece of regulation in Brazil, that is the Route 2030, that will also address this problem.
Para mostrar o quanto está consolidada essa decisão, Márcio, que você reafirmou de ser uma lei, é que todo o processo de complementariedade agora, de regulamentação, está envolvendo um conjunto de universidades, de instituições, não exclusivamente governamentais, o que garante esse nível de aderência também.
And this process right now is not just a government discussion, but also involves a lot of technical and university and research institutions in Brazil.
E uma questão última aí que foi dito ao longo das intervenções aqui, mas deve ser ressaltado. Quando nós falamos de biocombustíveis, vamos além do etanol. Biodiesel, biometano e bioquerosene para a aviação também.
Just to make clear that when we talk about biofuels in Brazil, we're not just talking about ethanol, but we're talking about biodiesel, biomethane, and jet fuel from biofuels. So those are also areas and different fuels that also have to be members of this legislation.
Thank you. I think we have one last question before. We have one here, two questions, okay? Okay, three questions, and then
this is for anybody, Mr. Nastari. You mentioned some of the international headwinds. You mentioned India and Thailand. I know Japan recently relaxed some restrictions that are allowing more U.S. exports of ethanol into Japan. Will Panelists be impactful from maybe combating some of the demand that in the international markets that some of the other markets are absorbing? Will it kind of increase demand locally to kind of combat any oversupply in Brazil?
I don't know if I understood well your question, but Renova Bio will increase potential markets for biofuels, including corn and cane ethanol. We believe a lot in the opportunity of expansion of corn ethanol as well in Brazil, be it domestically or imported. And we think it plays an important role. We see investments in corn ethanol growing quickly in Brazil, essentially because of cheap corn at origin. So if you go to the north of Mato Grosso, you have today corn at $1.8 bushel. So ask anyone in the US whether he would like to produce ethanol with $1.8 bushel, and that's what is happening. And corn production in Brazil is expected to increase continuously from the current around 90 million to 150 million tons in 5 to 6 years. This will mean cheap corn at origin. So I think we'll see more complementarity between corn and cane ethanol production. And Brazil will certainly have surplus ethanol again for exports to help the strong initiative which the U.S. is doing to open markets worldwide. And all this having in mind that increase in bioenergy and biofuels production is doable, in spite of what some people have said about food versus fuel, which is a very Eurocentric vision, because simply they don't have 1 hectare to expand in Europe. But there are many, many hectares to expand in Africa, in Latin America, Southeast Asia, all over. So I think this will continue to expand. And what we're trying to do is essentially do it in an efficient way, more economical way.
I think we had a question.
My question actually relates very much to the corn. I'm interested in what the panel views as, as you've seen the fundamental biofuel business is a very good business. The sugar companies, the crushers are all structurally in trouble because of their balance sheets, but they're in a good business. Do you think the coming online of these number of corn plants, which there are about 5 or 7 that are coming online soon, will that help the process, or will that continue to make excess supply and make it more difficult for the sugar crushers to reorganize themselves?
To answer that, we calculated what is the capacity of plants already in operation and in the planning process, and we reached 3 billion liters by 2021 capacity. When they're ready, they're going to be using 30% of corn from Mato Grosso, which is very interesting because in the US we have 38% of US corn being converted into ethanol, so we're reaching the same kind of proportions in Mato Grosso. And if we see that this could happen as well in west of Bahia, south of Piauí, in other areas in Manitoba, we could easily see corn ethanol in Brazil expanding to 5 to 6 billion liters in 10 years. But that's it, And corn ethanol can complement a lot cane, because if you look at cane, you have 3 to 4 months where cane mills are in the off-season period, shut down. And you could use the distillation capacity of these mills during the off-season to continuously produce processing corn. So this is already happening in some mills. They're investing in this complementarity between what we call flex mills. And I think this will happen as well. And this will be a quick way to increase ethanol production in Brazil. And we'll see more and more of that. And this will mean more DDGS, more poultry, more feed lots, more and less pressure in the logistics for transports of grain in Brazil.
And I think the last question in the back.
My name is Guy Nastari from the Aerodrome. My question is to Mr. Salvatore. Using Dr. Spinio say about operational rating system, do you believe for foreign investors is a good instrument to create transparency and brings measurements or kinds of monitoring to create a longer-term relationship and provide more environment for new investments?
Thank you for the question, Guilherme. Of course, I think this instrument, this tool can be used at the moment of the restructuring, just to fix metrics so that in a transparent manner the investor can follow what's from an operational standpoint is happening at mill level. And after restructuring, in the process of monitoring, as we say, So it has been requested that by investors in the package of engagement that we call watchdog monitoring activity. And you are completely right. If you have a process to be implemented and to serve the interest of investors, either someone that is throwing new money into this type of investments, or someone that needs help in the process of restructuring after the restructuring, absolutely, this is an important potential permanent tool to be used.
Well, we have gone past our time, and I'm sure there might be some other questions that individuals may want to ask some of the panelists separately, but I did want to thank the Congressman again for taking the time to join our panel. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for attending, and again, thank you, Ted, and the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce for organizing such a great event. Thank you.